Well, hey, what's up, YouTube? In a previous video, I mentioned the concept of the verse-by-verse layout style, and the reason I did that is because of the trend away from verse-by-verse layouts. You'll notice, if you're paying attention in the Bible production world, that more and more the Bible publishers are trying to move to single column instead of double column, and moving away from such formulaic structures as reference columns and things like that to a more organic reading style, such that even some new Bibles are being produced without chapters or even verse numbers, just to make the Bibles look more and more like a normal book that you would read from in a normal reading experience. So I guess the trend is not only away from stylized and formulaic layouts to a more organic look, but even more so away from what has been the standard layout for any number of years, which would be the verse-by-verse format, in which each verse of the Bible is dropped down to a new paragraph with the verse number preceding the verse itself. Now, I've been experimenting with preaching with verse-by-verse Bibles because I'm kind of moving away from the trend towards the organic and back towards the standard that has been used for many decades and indeed centuries, the verse-by-verse format. And the reason I'm doing that is because as a preacher, it's very, very helpful to be able to look exactly at the verse that you're trying to preach from, especially if you make your points in a verse-by-verse style of expository preaching. So I've been experimenting with a couple of Bibles that I want to introduce very quickly today, and I will post a link to all of these particular Bibles in the description of this video below on YouTube. So let's go ahead and have a look at a couple of them. This is a verse-by-verse New King James printed by Holman, and you can see this would be the standard style where you have two columns on the left and on the right, and you have a reference suite down the middle between both columns. And of course, the benefit here, this is a red letter edition, is that each verse begins a new justified left. And so as you're preaching or as you're reading, it's very easy to find verses and follow along with the preacher. And you'll see that even some verses that start new important sections are even bolded more so than the others. So for instance, we're looking at verse 24 here of Matthew chapter 17, and that verse is bolded more darkly than verse 25, which follows it below, and that indicates that there's a topic or section taking place. Well, this would be a good preaching Bible for verse by verse through the New King James. However, this font is quite tiny. It's not much bigger than the Cambridge Pitt Mini, if you're familiar with that hand-sized Bible. So let's move over to one that's just a little bit larger. And changing translations, let's move over to the King James Version. This is the Windsor text done by Trinitarian Bible Society. Now, you'll notice a couple of things here. This Bible is not red letter. Of course, we're looking at the book of Esther, so we wouldn't expect to find any red letters anyways. But what this lacks is a reference suite. Obviously, there are no references in the center column, nor are there references anywhere. And that provides us with a very nice, clean layout. So it's very nice to read and to look at. However, I won't have the advantage of looking at references as I consult my biblical text. Another thing that you're going to notice is that the Windsor text has very little paragraph breaks. They do have the old-fashioned pilcrows. Let's go ahead and look at one such pilcrow there. And can you see it in verse... I'm trying to get my camera to focus. There it is. Verse 8 has a little pilcrow indicating a new section. But we don't see any section headings other than the section headings that are given at the top of the page. So I've found that sometimes if I'm looking for a familiar passage, it actually makes it quite difficult because those section headings are used, I guess, at least in my mind, more often than I think I use them. And so if I'm looking for something like the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes, I find that it's a little bit difficult to find it because the text all looks basically the same. Well, let's go down here now to another Bible, and this would be a good one for preaching. In fact, I use this one for preaching when I use the King James in the pulpit, and this would be the Church Bible Publishers 355. Here you're going to notice something even better for preachers, and that is a larger font and a darker typeface. And so I've found that this is pretty much the best one I have when it comes to preaching from a verse by verse in the King James. It's excellent. And believe it or not, these margins, they're a little bit wider than they look. So from time to time, I can take a note in the margins. And I really love preaching from this particular Bible if I'm going to preach in the King James. Now let's go to the English Standard Version. And unfortunately, in the ESV, you only have a couple of options for verse by verse formats in the ESV, and here's one of them. You're going to notice one of the flaws to this Bible immediately is that it is not line matched, and that shows through a lot of ghosting. The paper isn't the best in the world, but this would be probably my favorite style, verse by verse, of the ones that we've looked at. First of all, we do notice that there are section headers. You see born again to a living hope in 1 Peter chapter 1. And man, look how the verse numbers are not only bolded, but also set apart. They're tabbed in slightly and tabbed in from the text. And so really a very strong emphasis on the verse, probably the best of any that we've looked at. And so I happen to love preaching from this Bible. Is a double column verse by verse ESV, and it does have the reference suite to it. So if I want to use references for study, I can find that on the bottoms of the pages on the right hand column. Now, one quibble with this text, and I don't know why this is done, this really drives me nuts, but you have the margins on either sides of the page are different in size. So for instance, this left margin over here is larger than this right margin. You can see that in both places I've tried to squeeze in a tiny little preaching note to myself just to give me a little reminder of my sermon outline. Why in the world is the outer margin so much bigger than the inner margin? I guess when you pull back, it makes the symmetry look better, as the center margin is roughly equivalent to the two outers. And so I guess there's something that's sort of aesthetically appealing to the eye. But I find that if I'm actually going to use this Bible for what it's for, which is verse by verse preaching, I really wish that the margins would be equal. Okay, so there's some reflections on verse by verse Bibles. The trend, of course, is away from that kind of formulaic structure towards the more organic, single column layouts with very little clutter. But there's something tried and true about a good old-fashioned verse-by-verse reference Bible. Thanks for checking in. That's all I've got to say today. I will post the link to these particular Bibles in the description of this video. Subscribe if you want. Don't if you don't. Have a great Lord's Day. It's tomorrow. Don't forget to worship with your believing congregation in the fellowship of the local church. Talk to you later.